Okay.
So we'll get going. Good evening. I'm Michael Riff, Director of the Gross Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Ramapo College. And it's my great pleasure to welcome everybody here this evening to what promises to be a very interesting and highly enlightening program in which Jeffrey Epstein, sorry, Sussman, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
That
don't get me mixed up with that person.
No, never. Sorry, Jeffrey Sussman will discuss his new book, Holocaust Fighters, Boxers, Resistors, and Avengers, published last month by Roman and Littlefield. The book is a probing and moving account of the many ways in which people resisted Nazi rule. It provides moving portraits of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of incredible adversity. Holocaust Fighters, Boxers, Resistors, and Avengers tells a number of riveting stories that you will soon hear about in actually a few moments. Before introducing Jeffrey Sussman, let me announce that this program is supported by a grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH, through the American Rescue Plan Act. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. Now, let me introduce our honored guest. In addition to heading his own marketing public relations firm in New York City, Jeffrey Sussman is the author of 10 nonfiction books, 2 novels, and dozens of short stories, book reviews, and numerous articles on a wide variety of topics. As if that weren't enough, he wrote and produced 2 television series. Sussman also teaches marketing and promotion courses at the New School for Social Research in New York City. Before handing the floor over to Jeffrey, I would like to ask for your support so that programs like this evening's continue to happen. Donations in any amount may be made online by going to www.ramapo.edu/give, or you can drop a donation in the mail to the Gross Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Ramapo College, 505 Ramapo Valley Road, Mahwah, New Jersey, 07430. Finally, I just want to make you aware that there will be a Q&A following Jeffrey's presentation, and you can submit questions through the chat function here on Zoom. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Jeffrey, and thank you again all for coming. And I trust you will have an extremely enlightening evening. It's all yours, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. A number of people asked me how I came to write Holocaust Fighters, Boxers, Resistors, and Avengers in the first place. I had written a number of books about boxing, and the first one I wrote was called Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing. I had always been interested in the role that Jews played in boxing. In America, Jews dominated the sport of boxing from 1910 to 1941. there were a little over 200 Jewish boxers at that time, and 24 of them were world champions. In the course of doing research for these various boxing books, I came across the story of a man named Harry Haft, who had been a prisoner at Auschwitz and was forced to box there in order to save himself. So this led me into doing research on other men who had to box while imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps. And in my book, I profile 4 Jewish boxers and 1 Sinti Roma boxer. Sinti Roma is the formal name for gypsies. Gypsy is really a colloquial word. And the first boxer I profiled was a Tunisian Jew named Victor Perez. He became the youngest featherweight champion of Europe when he was just about 20 years old. And he was a very charismatic young man. He was small, which is why he was a featherweight. He was only about 5'1" and quite trim. But he was very handsome, very charismatic, and he had a number of affairs with several French movie stars, one of whom was a woman named Mireille Ballin, who was one of the top French movie stars in the 1930s. And they had a very hot affair that went on for several years until the Nazis conquered France. And being an actress and an opportunist looking for the main chance always, she realized that her future lay with the Nazis, not with Victor Perez, who was Jewish. And even though they were a celebrity couple, she wound up betraying him to her new Nazi lover, a man named Burl Despach. Sounds a little like despot. And Victor had an older brother who was also training to be a boxer in Tunis, and he tried to get Victor to return to Tunis because he felt that he would be protected there, that he had a better chance of surviving the Nazi occupation in Tunis than in Paris. However, Victor was such a celebrity in Paris, not only because he was the featherweight boxing champion, but also because of his affair with Ballin. They were regularly photographed on the Champs-Élysées. They were photographed in nightclubs and restaurants, out on shopping sprees and so forth. And he thought that his celebrity would protect him from anything injurious that the Nazis might want to do to him. Well, he was wrong, because after Ballin betrayed him, he was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. And from Auschwitz, he was sent to a subcamp called Monowitz, which was run by the IG Farben chemical company. And there he was put to work, really kind of backbreaking work, working 12 to 16 hours a day and giving minimal nourishment. But eventually they realized, the Nazi guards realized who they had there, that here was someone who had been a world-class boxing champion. And for the entertainment of the SS guards, they forced him to fight other members of the camp. And he had to fight probably about 2 to 3 times a week just to stay alive. And one time they put him into a bout with a man who was considerably larger than he was. And he, as I said, he was a very small person, but after being malnourished and overworked, he was really emaciated. And this larger boxer was beating him to a pulp. Now, the Jews in the camp were told that they could come and watch this spectacle, but they had to keep their heads down. And if they lifted their heads up, they could be sent to the gas chambers. However, they were able to lift their eyes enough so they could see what was going on. And they felt terrible that Perez was getting beaten so badly. And because he was a young boxer, his name in Paris had been Young Perez. And all of a sudden, the Jews who were watching this started whispering his name in chorus. They were saying, yeah, 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 yeah. And this finally got to him, and it inspired him, and he was able to overcome the size differential between himself and this much larger man. And he called upon all of his old boxing skills, and he defeated this person. Well, this really angered the SS guards, and they continued to give him fights, and he continued to win the fights, because he knew that if he lost, there was a good chance that he would be dragged off to the gas chambers and killed. Eventually, as the Allies were closing in on these camps, the Nazis instituted what was called a death march to evacuate the camps and try to destroy the evidence of the crimes they had committed. And he was being marched out of Monowitz with a number of other Jewish prisoners. And off to the side of the road, he spotted a stale loaf of bread. And he went to grab the loaf of bread to feed himself and to feed several of his friends who were marching with him. And an SS guard saw him, picked up a rifle, and shot him twice in the back of the head and killed him. That was on January 21st, 1945. He was 33 years old and was killed. Incidentally, his lover, who had betrayed him, after France was taken over by the Allies, she and her German lover tried to escape to Italy, and they were hunted down by Free French forces, and they shot her lover, Despach, and she was captured. She was taken to prison. She was gang raped a number of times, and then sent to another prison where she was raped again. And she died in 1968 in absolute poverty. She was held out as a traitor in France and treated as such for the rest of her life. Now, the second boxer who I wrote about was a man named Nathan Chapow. And I had the good fortune of being able to interview his son, who lives in Los Angeles. Now, like Victor Perez, Nathan Chapow trained as a boxer in a Maccabee club. And there were Maccabee clubs for Jewish athletes all over Europe at that time. And they were Zionist clubs. I mean, these were people who believed in Zionism and also believed in being able to defend yourself. And one of the ways of defending yourself was to learn to be a boxer. And Nathan Chapow was a natural athlete. He was not only a boxer, he was a wrestler, he was a soccer player, he was a football player. And he grew up in Riga, Latvia. And when the Nazis came and conquered Riga, he realized that he would have to fight against these people in order to stay alive. And his motto during that period was, better to die a brave man than to be killed as a coward. And he carried himself with a great deal of dignity, and there was a movement to his step that indicated that he was a self-confident athlete. However, there was an SS officer in that town who hated Chapow. The man was, his name was Hoffman, and he would, at every opportunity, he tried to humiliate and treat Chapow with a total lack of dignity, yelling at him, hitting him with a stick, doing whatever he could to berate this man. And one day, Hoffman followed Chapow into his home, and he made Chapow stand up against a wall with his arms and legs outspread, also pressed up against the wall. And Chapow turned his head to see what Hoffman was doing. And at just that moment, Hoffman was pulling a Luger out of his holster. Chapow, being an excellent athlete and a proficient boxer, quickly turned around and punched Hoffman so hard in the face that he knocked him unconscious. He also then withdrew Hoffman's pistol. He was about to shoot him, but then he realized that the sound of gunfire would attract other SS men and that they would come in and probably kill him. So instead, he took a lamp off a dresser and used the heavy base of the lamp to batter in Hoffman's head. He obviously killed him. And then he wrapped Hoffman's body in a shroud. And in the middle of the night, let's say around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, he dragged Hoffman's body to a dark alley, hoping that it would take days for the SS to discover the body. Unfortunately, the body was discovered the next day, and the SS rounded up all the Jewish men of Riga and brought them into the town square and said they wanted the man who was responsible for the death of Hoffman to step forward. Now, Schapow realized that if he stepped forward, they would kill him for doing this. And the Nazis said that if the guilty party does not step forward, we're going to hang 2 innocent Jews in the town square. This was a horrible dilemma for Schapow. If he steps forward, he's going to be killed. But if he doesn't step forward, he'll survive, but 2 innocent men are going to be killed. And he didn't step forward. And 2 innocent men were brought out, and they were hanged by the Nazis. This was a terrible experience for Schapow, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. And to make matters worse, not long thereafter, 25,000 Jews of Riga were taken to what was called the Rumbala forest, and all 25,000 of them were machine gunned to death there. Schapow avoided that as well, and he was captured, though, and sent to a concentration camp called Kaiserwald, or Kaiserwald. And there he was, like Perez, was forced to fight for his life. And he had over 200 fights, and he won every single one of them. And the guards were getting almost annoyed that he was so successful at winning his fights that they brought in a former middleweight boxing champion named Werner Samuel, and Schapow managed to beat him as well. Well, the Nazis decided they wanted to get rid of this guy, so then they sent him to another camp called Stutthof, and the guards there were really even worse than the guards were at the previous camp he had been in. When the Jews were disembarked from the trains that brought them into Stutthof, the guards would sing a terrible song to them. And here's what they sang. They sang, "The Jews go through the Red Sea, the waves close in, and the world is happy. Jews are drowned." This was unbelievable. And as soon as the Jews would disembark from the train, those who weren't immediately shipped off and killed, they were beaten, they were treated terribly. From Stutthof, he had the good fortune of being able to go to another camp called Magdeburg. And the reason he got there is because the commandant of that camp came to Stutthof and asked if there were any men who had been engineers before the war. And Schapow said, "I was an engineer," and they didn't ask him in what field he was an engineer or what his skills were. They just said good, and they shipped him off to Magdeburg. But there, he wasn't required to exercise any engineering skills. They actually just put him to work cleaning floors. And when it was time to evacuate that camp, because the Allies were closing in, the camp was surrounded on 2 sides by I think 3 sides actually, by water. And there weren't enough boats to ship all the Jews out of the camp. So the Nazis rounded up 50,000 Jews in the camp and put them in the water and machine gunned all 50,000 of them. Schapow managed to escape from that camp with several other allies. And from there, he and these other allies that he escaped with were able to get a hold of some SS Guard uniforms. And Schapow got a shirt and some boots. Somebody else got a pair of pants. Someone else got a hat. And when they encountered the Allied forces thought that they were Nazis. And Schapow couldn't speak any English, and the Americans couldn't speak Yiddish, which was the language that he was trying to speak to them in. However, they did find an American soldier who spoke Yiddish, and he was able to question Chapow and discover that Chapow, in fact, had been a prisoner of all these concentration camps. Shortly after that, Chapow left, and he was able to get a book passage to what was then Mandate Palestine. And when he was walking in the streets of Jerusalem one night, he encountered a man who had stolen money from his mother and his brother back in Riga. His mother and his brother had given this man money so that they could get exit papers to get out of Riga and go to a safe country in Europe. However, after their money was stolen, they were confined to Riga, and his mother died there. When Chapow encountered this man in Jerusalem, he beat him almost to death. He was so angry. And after that, he joined the Irgun and helped to fight for Israeli independence. And after Irgun, he joined the IDF. And while a member of the IDF, he met his wife. They got married in Israel. They moved to Chicago. And from Chicago, they moved to Los Angeles, where they had two children, Mike and Adina. And he opened a successful trucking company. The next person I wrote about was the middleweight boxing champion of Greece. And he attained that title just as he was turning 17 years old. His name was Salamo Aruk, and he was from Salonika. Salonika had the largest Jewish population of any city in Greece. 35% of the population was Jewish. And for centuries, they had worked as stevedores, loading and unloading ships. And because there were so many Jews in the town shut down on Saturdays to help the Jewish citizens enjoy the Sabbath. And when the Italian army invaded Greece, all the Jews, along with the Greeks, fought very hard against the Italian invasion, and they defeated the Italians. They drove them out of Greece. Well, this was very upsetting to Hitler and the Nazis, and the Nazis then invaded Greece, and the Jews and the Greeks were not so successful. They were roundly defeated, and Hitler sent a terrible person named Alois Brunner, who after the war was tried as a war criminal. He escaped and he went to Syria, where he became a friend of Assad, and his job in Syria was training he became a member of the Ba'ath Party there, and his job in Syria was training Syrian soldiers how to torture and kill captured Israeli soldiers. But on March 15th, 1943, Aruk, his father, his mother, his sisters, and brother all arrived at Auschwitz. And except for Salamo, they were all killed. His brother was killed because his brother refused to remove the gold fillings from Jewish victims who had been gassed. And so an SS guard shot him in the head and killed him. Because Salamo was a boxer and known as a boxer, he had to fight to save himself there as well. And he beat an enormous Czech fighter, a man who was almost twice his size, and they didn't think he would be able to beat him, but he did. And because of that, he was given special treatment. And the special treatment just consisted of giving him an extra slice of bread and a little bit of potato soup every day, just to keep him alive. And next, they brought in a fighter who they were sure would beat up Salamo. He was a man who had won 100 previous fights. His name was Klaus Silber. And once again, Salamo managed to beat this person. And the Nazis were so angry about it that after the fight, they dragged Silber away, and he was never heard from again. It was said that either he was shot or that he was gassed for losing the fight to Aruk. Next, Aruk was scheduled to fight a boyhood friend of his named Jacko Razan, who was quite a good boxer. He had won 120 fights. And the day before they were to fight, the camp was about to be liberated. And so they did not have to fight, and they were both very grateful for that. After the camp was liberated, Haruk, also like Chapow, went to Mandate Palestine, and there he joined the IDF, and he fought for Israel not only in the 1948 war, but also in the Six-Day War in 1967. He died of a stroke there in 2009, and had created a very nice, warm, loving family for himself in that country. The next person I wrote about was not a Jewish boxer. His name was Johann Trollman. He was Sinti, which is one of the two forms of what's known as gypsies. They're either Sinti or Roma, and they don't like to be called gypsies. They regard the term as derogatory. He was a very swarthy-looking young man who had black curly hair, and he was sent to a German public school where all the students looked to be fair-skinned and light-haired or blonde. And so he was always being picked on. He was always being bullied. And his father then sent him to a boxing gym to learn to box so that he could defend himself. And he became quite a proficient boxer. And he was trained by one of the greatest Jewish boxers in Germany at that time, a man named Erich Seelig, who was a German boxing champion until the Nazis took away his boxing title and forced him at the point of a gun to leave Germany. He eventually settled in New Jersey. But Johann Trollman turned out to be such a good boxer, but because he was a member of what was considered a subhuman minority, he was not permitted to fight in either the 1928 or the 1936 Olympics. And he had developed a style of boxing that was very much like, if you're familiar with Muhammad Ali, float around a boxing gym, almost dancing. And Johann Trollman did the same thing. In fact, in the ring, he was known almost as a ballet dancer. And the German style of boxing at that time was to stand flat-footed in the center of the ring, trade punches with an opponent. But because Johann Trollman danced around the ring, and he was so quick with his hands and his feet, it was almost impossible for an opponent to hit him. And he was scheduled and did fight a German boxing champion named Adolf Witt. And he beat Adolf Witt and was declared the light heavyweight boxing champion of Germany. However, the Nazi Boxing Commission was very upset about this, so they rescinded his title. And that caused an uproar from boxing fans. They thought this was very unfair. So the Nazi Boxing Commission reinstalled his title the following day. But then they told him that he would have to fight Adolf Witt again. And this time, he'd have to fight in the German style. No dancing around the ring, no slipping punches the way he would do. He'd have to stand there and trade punches with Witt. Well, Trollman had a sense of humor about all of this. He dyed his hair blonde, and he put white baking powder all over his body. He became a parody of the Aryan Superman. And when he entered the ring with his dyed blonde hair and his body covered with white powder, everyone in the audience laughed, including a number of the Nazi spectators. And of course, he lost the fight because he was told to lose. He had to lose. And he lost the fight. And after he lost the fight, he was drafted into the Wehrmacht. And he was sent to the Eastern Front to fight. And he was badly wounded, and so badly wounded that he had to be sent home to recover from his wounds. Well, he was no longer any use to the Nazis at that point. So rather than giving him a medal or sending him to a place where he could do clerical work, they sent him to a concentration camp. And after that, the Wehrmacht dishonorably discharged every single member of the army who was either a Sinti or a Roma. They felt that these people were beneath being Aryans, and they shouldn't be permitted to fight alongside Aryans. So Johann was sent to a camp named the Neuengamme concentration camp. And there he was very badly beaten by the guards. And he wasn't given an opportunity to fight there. and he was very constantly being beaten up and treated terribly. But there were a lot of inmates there who liked him. He was kind, he was sweet. And when somebody else in the camp died of starvation, they gave that person Johann Trollmann's name and said Johann Trollmann had died. And they gave Johann Trollmann the dead man's name. Well, after the dead man named, who had been given the name Johann Trollmann, was cremated, they sent Johann Trollmann's family the bill for the cremation. But they were also worried that the camp would eventually discover what they had done. And so they arranged for him to be sent to another camp, the Wittenberg camp. And there he was recognized as the boxer that he had been. And he was forced to engage in a series of boxing matches, all of which he won. And there was a very vicious capo at this camp named Emil Cornelius. And he was much larger than Trollmann. And the guards said that he had to fight Trollmann. And Trollmann managed to beat Emil Cornelius and beat him quite badly. Well, Cornelius was so humiliated and upset about this that as a capo, he set Trollmann all kinds of tasks, really backbreaking work. And this went on for days on end. And finally, Cornelius had enough of this, and he snuck up behind Trollmann one day with a club and beat him to death over the head. And Trollmann was only 36 years old when this happened. So the next person is the one that I mentioned at the beginning, who initiated my interest in all of this, was a boxer named Harry Haft, who was from Poland. And he was a young man. He was only 16 when the Nazis came and arrested him. And his first encounter with an SS man was on the street. An SS man grabbed him, put his hand in a doorway, and slammed the door against his fingers, which were against the door jamb, and broke all the fingers in his hand. He was sent to Auschwitz, and his job there was taking the dead bodies that had been gassed and throwing them into the ovens to be incinerated. And a terrible thing happened to him while he was doing this. One of the men that he picked up, I think it was off of a wheelbarrow, to throw into an oven, was still alive. The man's eyes were open. And Haft didn't want to do this. He didn't want to throw this man into the oven. And the SS guard overseeing this said, if you don't throw him in, I'm going to shoot you immediately. So he threw him in, and he heard these terrible screams once the oven door had been shut. And 5 minutes later, he wound up throwing the man's wife into the oven. Thankfully, at least she was alive. She was dead at the time. So, but that experience had a powerfully traumatic effect on Haft for the rest of his life. And he had 76 fights in Auschwitz, all bare knuckles, without gloves. And what was also weird about these fights is that the guards assembled a group of Jewish musicians, primarily violinists, to sit around the boxing ring and play the violin while these men pummeled each other. It was the most extraordinary thing. And in one night, they forced Haft to fight 6 different opponents, one after another. Now, a professional boxer may have one fight a month or one every 2 months because it takes so long to recover from these fights. And here was a man who was half starved to death, who was emaciated, and he was forced to fight 6 men in one night, and he won all 6 fights because he knew that if he lost those 6 fights, he would be killed. And the terrible thing for him also was that he knew that the men that he fought and who lost, that they would either be taken over to the gas chambers and killed, or they would be slowly starved to death. And so this is just another trauma that he had to live with. But finally, he and one of his friends were able to steal some SS guard uniforms, and they managed to escape from Auschwitz. And they were chased by some guards, and they dove into a ditch. First, Harry went into the ditch, and then his friend on top of him. and his friend had been shot while falling into the ditch. And two SS guards ran up to the ditch, and one of them was about to take out his gun and fire some more bullets into the ditch. And his cohort said, "Don't waste your ammunition. They're both dead. Let's just go back to the camp." And that's how Harry Heft survived. He waited until the middle of the night and then extricated himself from the ditch and started walking away. The next morning, he was by a river, and in the river was a naked SS guard. He didn't realize he was a naked SS guard, and he saw this man, but then he spotted his uniform on the riverbank and realized he was an SS guard. And the man called out to him in German, and Harry Heft responded in Poland, and the SS guard asked if he was a Juden, and Heft realized all of a sudden that his life was in danger. He grabbed the man's gun as the man was rushing out of the river, and as the man was rushing towards him, he managed to shoot and kill him. And he then took the rifle butt and bashed in the man's head. He dressed in the man's uniform, hoping that this would save him in any future encounters with any Nazi soldiers. And he dressed this way until he arrived at an American camp. And once again, he had to prove that he wasn't a Nazi. He could speak Polish, he could speak Yiddish, but he couldn't speak English. And once again, they found someone, an American soldier, who could speak Yiddish and was able to verify that he in fact had been a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp. He lived in a DP camp for a while, and then he sailed to America, and he arrived in Brooklyn, and he stayed with some relatives in Brooklyn. He had no skills because he learned to box basically while he was in a concentration camp, and he had been taken away when he was 16 years old. He didn't have time for much of an education. He could neither read nor write, but he could box. And he thought, I'll make a career for myself as a boxer. And he hired a manager named Mandel to get him boxing matches. And he had some amateur boxing matches in New York, and then some professional ones. And his manager thought that he had come a long way and was able to arrange on July 18th, 1949, for him to fight a man who would become the future heavyweight boxing champion of the world, a man named Rocky Marciano, who wasn't well known at that time. But when Harry Heft was preparing for the fight in his dressing room, 3 mafioso came into his room, and they told him that if he didn't lose the fight to Marciano, they would kill him. And he learned that this was true because just several weeks earlier, they had killed another boxer who refused to take a dive while in the ring. Heft was knocked out in the 3rd round, and he felt that his life had been destroyed. Here he had survived 76 fights in a Nazi concentration camp. He comes to America to make a life for himself as a boxer, and 3 mobsters take that away from him. He opened a fruit and vegetable store in Brooklyn. He got married. He had 2 sons, but he was a miserable man. He was angry. He had been deeply traumatized by what he experienced in the camps, and he was mean to his wife, and he was mean to his sons. And though his wife understood why he was this way, his sons didn't. But as they grew up, they began to understand what their father had gone through, and they were able to finally forgive him when they understood what happened. Now, his son, Alan Heft, sent me a letter that he wrote to his father that I'd like to read to you, because I find it a very poignant, very touching letter. He writes, "Dear Popsy, you have been gone nearly 12 years, and I miss not having a father. Growing up, you beat me for my childish misbehavior. The rage you had inside you, you often took out on me. I feared your very presence. You broke furniture and punched out windows, abused Mom to no end. Despite the abuse, Mom always protected you, excused your behavior because of your background. I could not excuse you until I learned what that background was. I was ashamed of you. You could not read or write. You spoke broken English with a thick accent and had those green numbers on your arm. I wish I knew then what I know now. You suffered terribly at the hands of the Nazis. You saw horror and were forced to participate in it. After you told me all about your ordeal, what you had to do just to live another day, it helped me understand why you were, and who you are. I now see how sorry you are for the abuse. How can anyone judge you? They call you a Holocaust survivor, but does anyone really survive? It has been said that the Nazis murdered your soul. Popsy, I have spent my later years trying to make the world better for you. Your story was published by Syracuse University. You were inducted into the Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. There is a major motion picture about your life. I know that you would have been happy that I made you famous. Despite the physical and psychological abuse, I would want you to know I forgive you. Mom died this summer. She was the angel sent by God to care for you. Now it's your turn to take care of her. Love, Alan. And those are the 5 boxers who I profiled in my book. In addition to the boxers, I wrote about 2 very heroic men, Rudy Verber and Witold Pilecki, who both escaped from Auschwitz and wrote reports letting the world know about the terrible atrocities that were being committed there. The next section of my book deals with a group known as the Avengers, which was led by a man named Abba Kovner. There were 200 of them. They were from Vilna, and he tried to warn the citizens of Vilna that the Nazis were going to exterminate them, and they wouldn't believe that anything like that could possibly happen. He did, however, convince 250 of them, and they formed a group known as the Nakam, or the Avengers, and they fought alongside Russian partisans against the Nazis, and then on their own, up until 1950, they wound up killing 1,500 Nazi war criminals. They often disguised themselves as British soldiers. They went to the homes of Nazi war criminals, and they said they were wanted by British intelligence for interrogation and to please come along. The Nazi war criminals reluctantly went along, but then they were driven to a wooded area where they were taken out. They were told it was time for justice to be given to them. And they were forced to kneel down on the ground, and they were shot in the head. And this was done to 1,500 of them. The group more or less disbanded in 1950. Abba Kovner went on to become the leading poet of Israel and testified in the trial against Adolf Eichmann. I then dealt with a secret section of the Mossad, which carried on the work of the Avengers after the war, and they wound up killing an additional 2,000 war criminals, including a notorious man named Herbert Kukers, who was known as the hangman of Riga, for the thousands and thousands of Jews that he killed. And then finally, my book concludes with the trials of the Nazi war criminals and the penalties that were meted out to them. So anyway, that's the story of Holocaust fighters, boxers, resistors, and avengers. And if you have any questions at all, I would be very happy to answer your questions.
Oh, wait a minute. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
You know, your book is obviously fascinating, but I've, for one, I'm still puzzled about the motivations of the Nazis in staging these fights. I'm still, it wasn't as if it was just in one place. It was more widespread.
It was at many of the camps.
Yeah. And I just, was it just for entertainment, or was there some other, in a way, more nefarious motivation?
There was a somewhat nefarious motivation, because I read Mein Kampf, and there's a portion in Mein Kampf where Hitler talks about how important it is for Nazi soldiers to learn to box because it would make them better soldiers. And all the young boys who were put into the Hitler Youth movement, and that was all of them in Germany, they all had to learn to box. And there are these newsreels of these little tiny skinny kids with enormous boxing gloves on, flailing at one another. So for the Nazis, this almost became a parody of what they were doing. And they were setting it up to show that they were superior to the Jews. The Jews could box, but they could never overcome being Jews. They could never overcome being subhumans. And they could take on aspects of what the Nazis could do, but they could never do it as well. And they would have to do it for the Nazis' entertainment, just to prove to the Nazis in a kind of vicarious way that the Nazis were superior to these people and that the Nazis could force them to beat each other to death. And it was very sadistic. You're right, it was nefarious and it was sadistic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Now we have a question about that deals with how you went about writing the book. How long did it take you to research the book, write it, and nurse it to publication?
The whole thing took about a year. And the way that I did it is I researched each chapter separately. And as I finished the research for each chapter, I wrote that chapter. And I would write a rough draft of it. And while I was researching the next chapter, I would go back and write a second draft of that chapter. And I usually did 3 or 4 drafts of a chapter. And then as I finished the research for the next chapter, I would write a rough draft of that chapter. And then it would, I handed in the entire manuscript to my editor. And then it went through a copy editing stage. And I guess from the time I handed it in to the editor until it was published was about 5 or 6 months.
Oh, then it was done relatively quickly.
I'm a very quick writer, and I'm trying to produce a book a year, and for the last 5 years I've managed to write 5 books. So I'm very disciplined, and I lay out my task with an outline of what I have to do, and I give myself a certain number of weeks to accomplish each task, hoping that at the end of that time I finish. And if I don't finish, I become very anxious.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, that's those are very it explains why you're so prolific, and many of us would are envious of that kind of work ethic and just your ability to keep your nose to the grindstone and actually produce so quickly.
Well, when I was in college, I worked part-time for the Yiddish writer Isaac Bashevis Singer.
Oh.
I wrote his correspondence for him because he felt very uncomfortable writing in English. And he lived only a block away from me in Manhattan when I lived on the Upper West Side. And he was the most diligent person. I mean, he wrote every single day for hours. And when he wasn't writing, he was making up stories and telling me stories. And then he would elaborate on those stories when it came to writing a short story. So it was like he was working 24 hours a day.
Yeah, yeah. He benefited from a very caring wife.
Oh, she was wonderful.
Yeah.
Alma. You know what happened when I was in college? I used to earn extra money by photographing famous writers and artists, and then selling the photographs to publishers and magazines and newspapers. And I looked him up. He was listed in the phone book as living at 209 East 86th Street. And I called and I asked if I could come and photograph him, and he said yes. And after I finished photographing him, his wife Alma asked me if I had any free time because I was a college student at NYU. And I said, I have a couple of afternoons free. And she said, how would you like to help Isaac write his correspondence? He's very uncomfortable writing in English. So I said, I would love to. I'd be honored to. And so he would get letters from people, and he would give me the gist of what he wanted to say, and I would write it out in my own words based on what he told me. And he would look at the letter written in longhand because he had a Hebrew typewriter, and then he would sign his name to the letter that I had written, and all the mail would go out that way. So I had a lot of fun with it.
I can imagine. That's a great
But
opportunity.
but she worked as a sales clerk at Lord and Taylor's department store for 35 years, supporting him until he became self-sufficient as a writer.
I once was at a dinner with them in the New York Public Library in the Jewish reading room,
Right.
The Jewish collection reading room. And I remember her really doting on him. You know, he was a vegetarian, if I remember.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I was with him once at a news conference, and a reporter said to him, "Are you a vegetarian for health reasons?" And he said, "Yes, for the health of the animals."
Well put. Well put. Yeah. Changing gears a bit, I wonder whether you could perhaps go off topic. We're now just in the wake of the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht.
Right.
And there's an apocryphal story regarding the behavior of the German boxing champion, Max Schmeling. And perhaps you could relate that story.
Well, I have in my first book about Max Baer and Barney Ross, I have a whole chapter about Max Schmeling. Max Schmeling was perceived in this country to be a Nazi stooge and a Nazi sympathizer, and he was anything but that. He hated the Nazis, and he was very courageous in many ways. He had a Jewish boxing manager named Joe Jacobs, and Hitler insisted that he fire him, and Schmeling said, "No, I'm not going to fire him," and Hitler backed down, which took extraordinary courage to stand up to Hitler like that. And then on Kristallnacht, there were two Jewish teenage boys who Max Schmeling hid in his hotel suite in Berlin. And he called down to the desk clerk and he said, "If anyone wants to see me or calls for me, just tell them I'm sick and I'm staying in my room." And those two boys, after the war, they came. He helped to get them out of Germany, and they settled in the United States. They became very successful businessmen. And I think it was sometime in the late 1970s that they honored him at a ceremony in Las Vegas. I think it was a UJA ceremony, and he had done numerous things while he was in Germany to undermine the Nazis, and a couple of times Joseph Goebbels wanted him tried for treason and killed, but he was so popular that it was impossible to do that. And what was also interesting is, there's a famous fight, two famous fights between Max Schmeling and Joe Louis in this country in 1939. What a lot of people don't know is that Max Baer, who's only partially Jewish, fought Max Schmeling at Yankee Stadium in 1933, the first year that Hitler came to power. And Max Baer had a Jewish manager named Ansel Hoffman, and he told Max Baer what the Nazis wanted to do to the Jews of Germany. And Max Baer was so incensed and perceiving Max Schmeling as a symbol of Nazism, went into the ring and absolutely pummeled Schmeling so badly that the referee had to stop the fight in the 10th round, fearing that that Max Baer was going to kill Max Schmeling. Now, my father, who was a young man then, went to see that fight in Yankee Stadium. There were 60,000 fans there, and my father said he thought that probably half of them were Jewish. And when they saw Max Baer take his robe off and reveal a Jewish star on his trunks, they all stood up and cheered. And another part of the stadium were members of the German-American Bund waving Nazi flags around because they perceived Schmeling as being, a Nazi hero. And then when Baer finally beat Schmeling, the same people who stood up and cheered Bear when he revealed the Star of David on his trunks, they stood up again and cheered. They finally felt that they had a hero who could defeat a symbol of Nazism. And what was interesting, of course, is that Schmeling hated the Nazis and that Max Beer was only partially Jewish. But he only identified as a Jew in terms of going against the Nazis. And he was very happy to be considered a champion on behalf of the Jews. And from all of his fights thereafter, he always wore a Star of David on his trunks.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting story that a lot of people don't know.
Right.
You know, he had Schmeling had a bad rap.
A terrible rap. You know, at one point, Goebbels sent him to meet with the Pope and to try to get the Pope to say that the Pope was praying for a German victory. And when Schmeling came back to Berlin, Goebbels asked him what the Pope had to say, and he said, the Pope is praying for peace in Europe. And this so angered Goebbels that he denied the opportunity for any German newspapers to print what the Pope had said. And once again, he went and complained to Hitler that Schmeling was not someone who could be trusted. And then an amusing story happened later in the war. Schmeling knocked out a prize fighter. I think his name was Adolf Herzl. And the fight took place in the Adolf Hitler Arena. But the newspapers got it wrong. They said that Max Schmeling had knocked out Adolf Hitler in the Adolf Herzl Arena. And Hitler had a fit about that. And he wanted all the newspaper editors who printed that story, he wanted all their papers shut down.
Wow. That story I'd never heard, but amazing.
And I'll just tell you one other story about it. Before America went to war with Germany, Joe Jacobs went over there to be with Max Schmeling in one of his fights. And Schmeling knocked out his opponent. And the Nazis had already come to power. And Joe Jacobs ran into the ring to congratulate Schmeling for having won. And all the Nazis in the auditorium, in the arena, raised their right hands in the Nazi salute. Well, Joe Jacobs didn't know what to do, and he was always clenching a cigar. He took the cigar out of his mouth and he stuck it between his two middle fingers and held his arm up. It looked like a Nazi salute. But in the photographs, it looks like he's giving Hitler the finger. And this was a photograph that was also reproduced in the newspapers that infuriated Goebbels. And once again, he wanted to blame all of this on Schmeling. And then that Schmeling refused to fire this man. It was just extraordinary. And the last thing I'll tell you about Schmeling was after the war. He came to the United States. Joe Jacobs had died of a heart attack and was buried in a Jewish cemetery in Brooklyn. And Schmeling went to his grave and put a stone on his gravestone and brought the translation of the Kaddish with him and said it at Joe Jacobs' gravestone. It was really extraordinary how this man was misrepresented throughout his life.
Well, if we had time, I would have asked a little bit about Rudolf Weber, who is an amazing character who I once even had the privilege of escorting to a lecture.
He was an extraordinary man.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. Yeah. And he wrote a report that saved the lives of 100,000 Hungarian Jews from being sent off to Auschwitz.
That's right. But unfortunately, his report fell on deaf ears. And as we heard earlier, a few weeks ago, we heard from an Israeli researcher, Zohar Segev, who has looked at correspondence of American Jewish leadership, that people were not, they weren't really in a position to do very much. Neither the Jewish leadership nor American military personnel. And what's more, Jewish leaders were not were opposed to the idea of bombing the camps because of the inevitable loss of life that would follow.
What was interesting, though, about the Verba report, it was published in a number of Swiss newspapers.
Yes.
And there was an ambassador to Switzerland from South America who was Jewish. I can't remember his name offhand, who provided the report. And it was published all over Switzerland, and there were large demonstrations in support of that. And while Roosevelt, refused to have the railroads to the camps bombed, when he got word about this report, and it was brought to him, I think by Henry Morgenthau, he contacted the puppet head of Hungary, who had already sent hundreds of thousands of Hungarians off to the concentration camps. And he told him that if any more Hungarians were sent, that the Americans were prepared to bomb Hungarian army and Nazi army facilities in Budapest. And apparently that stopped the Hungarian government from sending any additional Hungarian Jews, the ones in Budapest, that is, from going to the concentration camps, though the Jews in the countryside didn't fare well at all. They wound up in the camps.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much. This was an enlightening talk, and I think we've learned a lot. And one final question: what is your next topic? Somebody asked that.
I'm writing a book about how Jewish mobsters started Las Vegas in the 1940s.
Oh yes, yeah. I forgot. Yeah. You're having fun with that, I'm sure. That's a little bit.
It's different.
Yeah.
I've gotten to interview. They're all dead now, so I've gotten to interview a number of the children of some of these people, and the stories are fascinating. Their fathers were all immigrants, and they made money initially as bootleggers, and then as gamblers, and they found a legal place where they could finally make a lot of money through gambling enterprises, and they created Las Vegas as we know it today.
Exactly. Well, again, thank you very much, and I hope people will read Jeffrey Sussman's book, which is available, of course, on Amazon and in bookstores. There it is.
Right.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. And if you could just send me a link to this talk so I could send it to my editor, I'm sure she would like to hear it as well.
Yeah, that'll be in a couple of days. All right.
That's fine. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.